Hello, my name is Russell Preston Brown from Adobe Systems, and in this tutorial I'm going to discuss the settings that you can choose when working with the GoPro Hero 3 Plus Black Edition camera. Okay, let's get started. Now there's been an update to both the firmware on the camera as well as the software. There's some great new features that really improve the quality that you can achieve with the GoPro Hero 3 Plus camera. I'm going to review those in this tutorial. What you're looking at here now is the screen that I've captured from my iPhone. With this iPhone application, I can control the GoPro Hero 3 Plus Edition camera directly and make adjustments. Throughout this demo, I'm going to use this interface to discuss each of the features. Okay, let's get started right here from the top with video resolution. There are several different resolutions you can choose from, and I'm not going to specifically give you one exact resolution that you should be using. So in this case, I'm just going to show you all of the different variations on resolution you can choose from. I will suggest my favorites though. For example, when I'm shooting aerial still photography, sometimes I shoot in the 4K mode at 12 frames per second to capture really great aerial stills. And my professional friends will also shoot in the 2.7K mode when they shoot professional video. And myself, I like to shoot my video at 1080. It's a nice compact size and it works really well for editing inside of Adobe Photoshop where I do a lot of my work. Okay, those are the resolutions. Let's look at the comparative size of each of those resolutions. Here's the 4K at the 17:9 setting, and here's the standard 4K, and you'll notice the size changes between each of these. Here's the 2.7K variations that you can see that many professionals use. And as you can see, it continues down through all of these different variations. A new setting on this software update is something called Super View, as you see here. I'm continuing down through the different variations, and you can see that there are several to choose from. And as I said earlier, it's your choice to determine which of these resolutions will work best for your particular project. Moving on, the frame rate. I tend to shoot at 30 frames per second, but you need to choose the correct value that suits your project. Let's go down here to field of view. Now, in some of the resolutions, you have the ability to choose wide, medium, and narrow. In this case, I've selected the 1080 setting for the resolution, and all three of these are available. Let's take a look at what this means. Here is the wide setting, as you can see here, on the 1080 setting for the video resolution. And here's the medium, and finally, here's the narrow. Check this out. In the background, you can see the 4K resolution image that's dimmed out. In the foreground, we can see the 1080 resolution set to narrow. I found it really interesting that it merely is cropping in on the full resolution, in this case, to give you this narrow view. Moving on, photo resolution. Now I thought I'd quickly talk about photo resolution as it relates to video resolution. I tend to shoot the 12 megapixel wide setting for many of my aerial photographs, but I'll sometimes shoot in the 4K mode as well for my photography. And I just wanted to compare the two side by side. So here is a 12 megapixel image taken with the Hero 3 Plus Black Edition. And here, using that same camera, is a 4K capture from the sky. So this was a video capture in the 4K mode, shooting at 12 frames per second, and I captured one of the frames out of that video. And I thought we might compare these side by side because it's really interesting. Here, of course, was the 12 megapixel. Let's zoom in on this area right here and compare the two. As you can see here on the left, we have the 4K video, and on the right, we have the 12 megapixel. I've blown them up so you can see the differences. Now they're really quite close. I think the detail and quality between them is very similar. However, over here on the 4K video, if I zoom in on this area, you can see that there's a lot of noise right here. also notice over here in the 12 megapixel image, I had the ability to pull out more detail in the color of the water, whereas over here in the 4K video, I didn't have as much access to that same quality of light. Overall, I was really impressed with the quality of image that I could get from the 4K capture here in the sky. This capture from video stood up very well as compared to the 12 megapixel image, and I think you should seriously consider using the 4K mode shooting at 12 frames per second to capture still images in many cases. Give that a try. Moving on. Right here to the photo time-lapse mode. Since you have to send the camera into the sky to do the photography on its own, you cannot control it from your radio. I tend to use the 2-second value you see here. It will then take one picture every 2 seconds. Once again, you need to choose the value that works best for your project. Moving on to the spot meter right here. Now, I highly recommend that you leave the spot meter off, and here's some reasons why. Here you can see in this image, the spot meter is off. Notice I have a balance between the exposure in the shadows in the foreground and the clouds here in the sky. I'm getting some burnout in the center, but in general, it's a balanced exposure because it's using an area averaging meter instead of the spot meter. Here's a photograph that uses the spot meter. Notice the spot meter is analyzing right here in the center. It's taking a reading, and it's trying to give us the best exposure for the foreground in the shadow. And the clouds and the sky are getting burnt out in this case. So once again, if we go back to the spot meter off mode, you can see you get an image like this versus an image like this. The answer is, in most cases, the spot meter should be off. Next, let's talk about ProTune, because there have been some significant updates to the firmware and software that have added some features that really add some amazing new controls that can improve the quality of your photography and video captured with the Hero 3 Plus Black Edition. Now let's take a look at these close up. I'm going to turn on ProTune right here. And as you can see, I now have several new features. Let's check these out one by one. Let's go right down here to white balance. The default is auto. Combined with the white balance is something called color. The default in this case is the GoPro color you see here. Let's go back up to white balance and click on this and see what the options are. You can see here that auto is the default option, but I highly recommend you set it to the 5500K setting. If I set this at an exact value, then I can maintain a solid, consistent white balance across all of my images or across my video. I highly recommend this, and the professionals recommend this as well. However, some professionals will also set this to the camera raw mode. The camera raw mode will give you the least amount of noise and the least amount of compression to your images. The camera raw mode also works extremely well with the GoPro Studio software. The GoPro Studio software will do an excellent job of converting the camera raw mode into some really nice color balanced imagery. Okay, now you know. Professionals choose the camera raw. I tend to choose the 5500K. Let's go back here to color. In combination with the white balance, you also want to set up your color. Now, I prefer to use the GoPro color, and I'm going to demonstrate why I choose that in just a minute. But professionals like to use the flat mode in combination with the camera raw mode. And again, let me demonstrate that in just a moment. So, in review, I use the GoPro color combined with 5500K when I do my aerial video. I really like these settings. However, some professionals prefer to use the flat mode combined with the camera raw mode. Using the flat and camera raw will make the least amount of adjustments to your image, and many professional videographers prefer to work with this mode and then do the color correction. However, I prefer to use the GoPro color mode and 55 because of the overall color quality I'm getting, and I do not have to work as hard at the color correction. Let me demonstrate this. Here with the GoPro color and the 5500K, this is what an image would look like. So I've taken a photograph using 5500K plus the GoPro color as you see here. Now let's take a look at this same image, but in this case taken with the flat setting for color and the camera raw setting for white balance. And this is what the image looks like. Now let's set these side by side to compare them. This combination is doing some color adjustment to the images. Now I realize I may be adding some noise and I may be reducing the overall dynamic range of my image by choosing this, but I like the fact that the color correction has already started. Now, some professionals, of course, as I said, will use the camera raw plus flat as you see below. It doesn't look really great here, but it hasn't been color corrected. Let's now take a look at both of these after they've been color corrected. Here, with the 5500K plus GoPro color, this is what the color correction can look like. It's really quite striking. Again, before and then after. Now let's take a look at the camera raw plus flat. This, of course, is before and then after. Really quite amazing. Now let's compare them side by side. I can't say that one is super better than the other. I like the more graphic qualities to the colors that I get with the 5500K plus GoPro color. Whereas videographers tend to like the camera raw plus flat. It gives them a lot more detail to work with. They're working with the raw ingredients throughout this process. And for example, working in GoPro Studio or Adobe Premiere, they can really capture all the details in the bright clouds or the shadows here in the bamboo. Let's zoom in on both of these. As you can see here on the top, it's the 5500K plus GoPro color, and on the bottom, camera raw plus flat. I think the bottom line is that you can choose either of these settings and get some really great results through color correction in Adobe Photoshop or Adobe Premiere or even GoPro Studio. So, in conclusion, I use the GoPro color with 5500K, and professionals around the world suggest the flat with the camera raw. I highly recommend that you run your own tests. For example, you could also combine the GoPro color with the camera raw and get yet a third level of results. So it's worth experimenting with these, but I think I've given you a better idea of how they both work. Moving on to the ISO limit. This is a great new feature that's especially targeted for low light situations. In this case, the default is set to 1600, and I typically leave it at that value. If you're doing low light photography, then you definitely want to adjust these settings. Let's start here at the 400 ISO limit. Let's take a look at this image right here. So I've set up a low light situation. I set my camera to 400 ISO. This value sets a limit on the sensor, so the image is very, very dark. If, for example, I set it to the 1600 ISO in the exact same location, it starts to lighten up the image. And here in the 6400, it gets even lighter. You're increasing the sensitivity of the sensor, and this is the value that it will be limited to. So if you limit at the 400, as we saw earlier, it's of course going to be dark. So you'll want to choose the exact ISO limit setting that will work best for your project. Okay, now you know about the ISO limit. And as I said, I tend to leave that at the 1600. The next setting here is sharpness. The default value is medium. If I click on this, you can see the 3 different settings you can choose from: high, medium, and low. Let's go ahead and start by taking a look at low. Here with this image, I'm going to zoom in on an area right over here. Let's blow that up and take a look at the low setting. Now I actually like this setting. Notice the clouds here in the center right here. Now watch when I shift to the medium setting. Notice how the noise has increased in the sharpening of the center section here in the clouds. And then here with the high value of sharpening, the noise has even increased to this value. If I review back through these again, you can see why professionals around the world choose medium, and I'm actually considering low. If I choose low, then I have the ability to go back in and sharpen this, for example, using Adobe Camera Raw settings or even Premiere settings. But in general, the medium value works quite well. And of course, you'll want to run your own experiments. Now, let's get down to something that's really, really exciting, and that's exposure. I've always wanted the ability to adjust the exposure on a GoPro camera, and now I can. I'm going to show you some experiments that will make you start to think about adjusting your exposure yourself. Here you can see the 0 value. These are the settings, for example, that you can achieve with negative values, -0.5, -1, and -2. Of course, you have the corresponding values for +0.5, +1, and +2. But in this case, I want to show you how a minus value for the exposure can improve the quality of your imagery. Okay, let's start with this setting right here. A typical setting, I'm photographing pointing up into the sky. I've got bright areas and dark areas, areas in highlight and areas in shadow. This is the 0 exposure. Check out the histogram. Notice that it's clipping the whites. We can clearly see that in the sky. The white values here in the sky are completely blown out and they're pushing off to the side, whereas the darker values, there's no clipping at all. Okay, let's try a -1 value with these new settings. Notice I'm starting to get more detail in the sky with a -1 exposure. Very interesting. Also notice I'm maintaining the detail in the shadows. That's pretty cool. Let's take a look at the histogram. So here on the right, we're getting more detail here in our highlights, and we are not clipping our shadows yet. Wow. Let's try the next level, a -2. In this case, I now can see all of the detail in the sky, and I can see all of the detail in the shadows. Now, of course, the original images came in very dark, and I had to adjust them to bring them up to these values. But let's take a look at the histogram. The histogram from the original image shows that I'm no longer clipping my highlight, and I'm not clipping my shadows. Because I have a nice balanced histogram, I can then go in and correct the image, pulling out detail in the shadows and the highlights. So ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, I have come to the conclusion that some exposure adjustment is necessary for all of my future photography with the GoPro Hero 3 Plus Edition. If it's not just a simple 0.5 in the minus value, I typically am gravitating toward the -1 value for most of my outside full sun photography. Now, I don't recommend this on every shoot, but I think you should run an experiment with your particular shoot and really consider using one of the minus values for exposure. Let's move on to the default power-up. Since I'm shooting video in this case, I want to set my default to video. It's often that my camera can turn on or off during the process of a flight, and if it turns itself off and it's not set to this video default, then you'll run into a problem because it may be in the photo setting when in fact you wanted video. So just something to watch out for. In conclusion, always be sure and purchase the highest quality video cards that you can find. In this case, I recommend Class 10 memory cards. So once again, get the best card you possibly can find. And there you have it. That concludes some of my favorite Hero 3 Plus Black Edition video settings and some suggestions on how you might proceed in running your own experiments. I'm really excited about the new additions to this software, and I hope you can experiment with these as well. Give it a try.